morning, everybody. I know you guys are still eating, but we're going to get started because we have a full day today. Appreciate everybody coming out, and I'd like to welcome you to a relatively nice day today. You know, it seems the more things change, the more they stay the same, whether it's politics or the markets or us in our lives. And our guest speaker may be familiar to some of you because the last time he spoke for me was in 1988 at our client appreciation event. But he's also one of the most sought after speakers in the financial services industry. And you're going to enjoy the message. How many of you guys have been with us since the 80s or 90s? Yeah, pretty big group, which is good. You know, a lot's changed. Various buildings over the years, staff, but the one thing that's really been consistent with what we do is the vision for our firm, which is simply to make people's lives better, whether it's yours as our clients, our community, or our team. We've had a number of initiatives, and we appreciate all of your support, whether it's the food drives, the golf outing, the shred day, which this year was kind of a record number of you took advantage of. But a new initiative that we started last year was something called Carver Cares. And the idea behind this was just to raise awareness of local nonprofits that support our community, because we do have a lot of resources here that people may not be aware of. And then also to help them monetarily by matching donations. You know, it's funny, all of the advisors in our office seem to get asked a lot about current events. You know, what should we do now? What should we change because this is happening? What do you think of this media item? And more directly, should we change what we're doing? You know, and really making a change after something happens is kind of too late. You know, we believe in proactively trying to allocate the portfolios and set you up so you don't have to make changes. Because reacting is certainly never as good as being prepared. Now, there are 3 reasons we would make changes to your portfolios. The first one is you. Something changes in your life. You need more income. You have a bunch of money to invest. Your taxes change, but it's about you. The second thing is an investment is lagging its peers or the index for a meaningful period of time. Andy, Trent, Nick, Cale, Mike basically spend every day looking at these types of things in our office. Not to make short-term swings or day trade, but to make adjustments if there's a consistent lag. The third reason we make a change is because your allocation gets out of whack. And obviously, to know what's the best allocation, we have to be talking to you. But in the end, unlike a lot of places, you're in control. You know, we believe these are your funds. You should make the final decision. So we don't have any proprietary investments. We don't use models. We don't make changes without speaking to you. Now, the one thing we keep hearing, and undoubtedly, as we get closer to the midterm elections, we're going to hear is this time it's different. You know, it's different this time. We have to react because it's going to be the next financial Armageddon. And if it isn't one thing, it's another. Warren Buffett said the 4 most dangerous words for investors are this time it's different. Because the fact is, it isn't. I mean, the circumstances are different, whether it's kids coming over the border from Mexico, or it's, you know, Israel and Gaza, or it's the Ukraine, or it's bombings in Syria, or the government shutdown, or whatever it is. It's different things. But at the end of the day, if you're properly allocated, it just doesn't matter. And it shouldn't matter. And that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about in a few minutes today, is to look at the last 50 years to get some context. Because, how many of you remember Peter Lynch? Big market guru, Fidelity Magellan. You know, Peter Lynch rightly said, far more money's been lost by investors preparing for corrections or trying to anticipate corrections than the corrections themselves. And that's absolutely true. You know, people try to jump in and out, get out, do this, do that. And again, we just don't think it makes a difference. Now, there's certainly going to be corrections. The market's going to pull back, and we can't say when. It could be 3 days, 3 months, 3 years. But I also believe the next 3 to 5 years could be some of the best years we see. In fact, I believe it's a once, twice in a lifetime opportunity to make money. I'm just going to spend a couple minutes talk about that, because everything we're inundated with from the media is negative. And you have to understand, both the media and politicians have a vested interest in crises. If there's not a crisis, you're not going to tune in or listen. And especially with this 24-hour news cycle, they need something to draw you in. And politicians, unless there's a crisis to solve, we don't need them either. And so, I guarantee you, as we get close to this election, there'll be all kinds of things. But let's look at some of the reasons very quickly. We have more energy reserves than the Middle East. Corporate profits are at record levels. Corporate cash is at record levels. We're the worldwide leader in manufacturing. Foreign investments are flooding into the United States now. And we'll talk about why. There's huge amounts of money sitting on the sidelines waiting to see what's going to happen. Both individuals and businesses have restructured their debt, so they're paying a lot less. And finally, innovation. How many of you guys have a smartphone? I mean, that thing has more technology than the first, Apollo capsules. The stuff that phone does, it's like what was science fiction 20 years ago. It's unbelievable. So, energy reserves, it's huge. It's more than 100 years of energy, and they keep finding more. And we've heard about the Marcellus and the Utica shale, because eastern Ohio is starting to pick up on that. The Bakken up in the Dakotas, and now down south they just found another big field. Household debt, it's collapsed. People have been saving since 2008 as a percentage of the economy. It's just fallen off a cliff. Corporations, same thing. Companies are paying 8, 9, 12% are now paying 2 or 3%. And even innovation. Now this isn't exactly what I was talking about. But the innovation that's happening is tremendous, and we are the worldwide leader in that type of thing. It's not about manufacturing. Let's keep hearing about all these companies that left or are leaving because of taxes. Well, look at the foreign companies that are coming here. It's over $100 billion of investment in the United States, whether it's Samsung, Airbus, Maserati building up in Detroit, Honda, Caterpillar building in Ohio again. There are dozens of companies coming back to the United States. A, because energy prices here are 1/3 of Europe's. B, because they don't pay any taxes here. And C, because our labor cost is half of the rest of Europe. Right now in Germany, it's about $67 an hour for an auto worker. It's about $34 here. So BMW is building X5s in South Carolina to ship back to Germany, because it's cheaper to build it here and ship it there. And that's all good for the economy. So all the noise, whether it's unemployment or the polar vortex or sunspots or whatever the Armageddon of the day is, really doesn't matter because the fundamentals are incredibly strong. And I think if we get distracted, we can kind of lose sight of what's really important and what we're trying to do. Americans produce 20% of everything in the world with 4.5% of the population. Chinese produce 17%, and they've got about 19% of the population. We're the most efficient, productive country in the world for manufacturing. And in fact, while the US produces 20%, American companies produce almost 40% of all this stuff in the world. But a lot of that, the money stays offshore. It's American companies, but companies like Apple or GE keep the money offshore because our corporate tax rate is just too high. It's 35%. There's bipartisan support to cut that tax rate to about 25%. And I think after the election that's going to happen. They're not going to do it before the election because politically that's tough to give breaks to companies. But when that happens, and it will happen, there's tremendous amounts of capital that are sitting. The Fed's been printing money for 3 years, and we haven't seen any inflation. It's because it's all sitting in the banks. Once that money starts to get deployed, we really think things are going to move up. So it's not to say we're not going to have issues. Market's going to go up and down. It's going to be frightening. But if you have questions, talk to anyone on our team. That's why there's 18 of us. All the advisors are here today. If you have questions, whether it's Mark, Nick, Gail, Andy, Trent, Mike, myself, any of the other team, if you have concerns, if you have questions, call us. One of the big advantages, Team 1 provides you a broader range of thought, and 2, it creates consistency. If something were ever to happen to any of us, there's other people there to work with. Because at the end of the day, we're 100% dedicated to helping you fulfill whatever you want to do. But for us to do that, we need to know what your vision is, what your concerns are. We feel the 3 biggest challenges we're going to face. One is inflation. People are living forever. How many of you know somebody that's 90 or older? It's a lot of people. I always ask this question. Mark hates this, but I gotta ask because I think it came from Don actually. How many of you paid more for the last car you bought than the first house you bought? Yeah, that's inflation. So, people used to retire at 65 and die at 67. Now they retire at 55 and they never die. They go to villages or Boca. It's like God's waiting room. So inflation. Second thing is medical expenses. And the third thing is making bad decisions based upon fear and greed or emotional responses. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Because we can learn from the past. Past performance doesn't guarantee what's going to happen, but it can certainly give us some perspective. And that's really the point of today, and what our guest, Don Connelly, is going to speak about. Don's been in the industry for almost 50 years, spoken all over the world, from universities to professional groups to groups such as yourself. And it's an honor and a privilege to have Don join us this morning. So, Don Connelly.
Good morning. I am delighted to be here. 1988, I can't believe that. I get to do this every week, wherever. This is really fun. And I've met some zany people, some fun people, but I got to tell you the most bizarre thing happened to me a couple weeks ago. I've been doing this, as Randy said, since 1967. And 2 weeks ago, took the cake. And I got to tell you what happened. I was speaking in San Antonio. Who's been to San Antonio? Not a great town? If you haven't been to San Antonio, there's a river that runs through the middle of the town. It's called, through the middle of the city, it's called the Riverwalk. There are hotels and shops along the river. There's a Hyatt hotel on the river. So I did a meeting just like this for an advisor in the Hyatt hotel. After the meeting, I was getting a cup of coffee, standing against the wall, and a woman approached me. I found out later she was in her mid-80s, almost late 80s, and her husband had passed away. And she said she was trying to settle his estate. And if you've been through an estate settlement, you know how horrible that is, how emotional that is. And a lot of his money, I worked for Putnam for many, many years, my sponsor here today. So she knew I had been formerly with Putnam. So she came up to me and she said, you know, I'm trying to settle this estate. It's horrible. Most of my husband's assets were in Putnam. Can you help me? And I said, no, I'm sorry. It's in the hands of the lawyers. I swear to God, she looked at me, said, this is so much trouble, I almost wish he hadn't died. I was absolutely flabbergasted. I was shocked. It was really funny. I want to pick up where Randy left off. I want to discuss inflation and medical expenses and bad decisions and all that stuff. I live in Sarasota. I'm sure a lot of you know Sarasota. I live on Siesta Key, if you know where that is. I play golf with 85-year-old guys. These guys retired 20 years ago. What was the mean income in America 20 years ago? Do you remember? What would take a guess? 20 years ago today, what was the mean income in this country? It's about $31,000. So my friends that retired well on $40,000 and $50,000 a year. They were doing really, really well. Never expecting to pay $80 to gas up their cars. I've got friends making $4,000 a month in income, spending $2,500 a month for medicine. Randy mentioned medical expenses. No one discusses getting sick. It's so costly. And down payment, Medicare is a down payment. Humana Supplemental is a down payment. I had a dear friend pass away a couple years ago. If you're a baseball fan, he was a pitching coach for the Cincinnati Reds. He died of multiple myeloma. He was diagnosed with bone marrow cancer in February, and he died in January. His hospital bills were $14,000 a day for 11 months. The Cincinnati Reds paid for that. But I got friends that retired on $40,000 a year. You know, I don't know if anybody here has psoriasis. I have psoriasis. It's not a fatal disease. It's a chronic disease. So I have to get a shot every 90 days. The cost of the shot is $16,000 every 90 days for one injection. Now I have a copay of almost $1,000. I don't pay the whole thing. But medicine and education have snuck under the radar where it's insane. So I get it's almost, you can't save enough, I guess is the bottom line. Somebody once said to me, the perfect retirement plan from the check to the undertaker bounces. If we can do that, we'll be in great shape. But the inflation and medical expense and poor decisions. So what I want to do today is address that whole issue. I don't talk about, I'm not a stock market guy. I'm not an advisor. The advisors know far more than I do. No one in the world can predict the stock market. Nobody. Nobody can predict interest rates. Nobody can predict the economy. I don't want to try to do that. I want to try to look back. Without a doubt, the stock market's the most emotional ride we're ever going to take. I mean, it's just so emotional. And a lot of people lose money, get wiped out. But you tell me, true or false? The New York Stock Exchange is 250 years old. True or false? Every single time in the last 200 years, the market's gone down, it's come back. Is that true or false? True. It's unequivocally true, is it not? Every single time it's gone down and come back, it's eventually set a new high. True or false? True. True. Then why do so many people lose money? We know it's going to go down. We know it's going to come back. We know it's going to set a new high. And we still lose money. Well, I guess the answer probably is fear is a bigger emotion than greed. I mean, fear is terrible. So what I want to do is I want to take a look back. Now, I want to look at the life of a baby boomer. I'm too old to be a baby boomer. I was born in 1945. I think the first baby boomer was born in 1946. But I saw by show of hands how many people made more for their last car than the first house. So a lot of people in my generation, and some older than me. So I want to take a look back at what it means to invest. Look, every generation is looking for reasons not to invest. We all look, saving money is not fun. And fear is a horrible emotion. So we look for reasons not to invest. 9/11 was a reason not to invest. An entire generation stopped investing. 9/11 was a totally unprecedented act. It was the most widely watched event in the history of the world. We all saw the second plane hit the building. The reality is there was nothing different about 9/11. It's happened before, many times. I don't take 9/11 lightly. You wouldn't know this. But as I said, I spent my career with Putnam, a lot of my career. Putnam had the third largest loss of life in the World Trade Center. Putnam's parent company, Marsh McLennan. I knew a lot of those people. But it's happened before. My mother's generation had 9/11 bigger than that. We've forgotten it. My mother's 9/11, 3,000 people didn't die. One guy died. He was a very handsome, charismatic guy from Boston. The country loved him. And one day in late November 1963 in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, he was shot dead. And America died that day. How many of you all remember that? A lot of you remember that. America died that day. Well, my mother went to her grave knowing the most egregious act in the history of the United States was the assassination of John Kennedy. But her mother had a 9/11 bigger than that. And that we've completely forgotten. My grandparents knew for a fact that the United States would be invaded on December 7th, 1941. The 7th Fleet was gone. There was nothing between Hawaii and America except blue water, and the Japanese were going to invade. I don't know if you know Coronado Island off San Diego. But I spoke in Coronado one night. It's as Tony as it gets. There was a guy in the audience, a little bit older than me. He was a young guy when Pearl Harbor was attacked. His father's neighbor was so convinced the Japanese were coming, he sold his father 2 houses for $10 on Coronado Island, just to get out of Dodge before the Japanese got there. So I asked myself one day, how many 9/11s? What's going on with the media? You know, every country, every culture has obsessions. America has really 2 obsessions that captivate their attention. One is disaster, man-made or natural. The miners in Chile down inside that mine, the little girl that fell in the well. We're obsessed by disasters. We're also obsessed as a nation about any attacks on our money. If you start messing with my money, you got my attention. Well, newspapers have to sell newspapers. TV has to sell time. So if you're a newspaper editor and you know Americans are going to buy stories about natural disasters and money problems, what are you going to write about? What are you going to show on TV 24/7? So I said to myself, and it never is different. Randy's right. All bear markets are caused by the exact same thing, a lack of liquidity. You can't sell your stuff. What leads up to it, totally different. But I asked myself one day, I was sitting around and said, how many 9/11s in the lifetime of a baby boomer? How many times has the press said, this time it's different? And that's what I want to talk about today. I don't know where the stock market's going, but let you and I draw a collective conclusion when I'm done. I want you to take a journey with me. I'm not a history teacher. You don't need to get a lecture. But I want you to step back in time and take a journey with me. Is it different this time? Now, I can't read this because I had cataract surgery, so I'm going to have to wing it here. But basically, I think that says 8,500 newspapers. Is that what that says? We're getting so much information, we're losing our common sense. I mean, there's just too much information to deal with. We have 200 million TV channels. 200 TV channels. A newspaper, we're losing our common sense. So if you're a long-term investor, here's the rule. There are 8 things you can do to give yourself a break. One is be long-term. We've lost our patience. I have 2 grandsons. They have no patience whatsoever. The younger the people, the less the patience. But we've got to be long-term. This is a long-term business. And you can take a moment. I'm not going to read a slide to you. But if you do those things, you'll be fine if you'll give it time to percolate. That's one point I wanted to make. I'll give Randy a copy of this so he has it if you want to get it. But Alan Abelson, from the late Greg, just passed away. Alan Abelson said, if you put money in the stock market and you look at the paper every day or you watch TV every night, it's the same as a guy walking up a hill with a yo-yo, watching the yo-yo, not the hill. And you say to the guy, are you gaining ground? Well, I don't know. Well, why don't you know? Because I'm watching the yo-yo. Well, get your eye on the yo-yo, get it back on the hill. The yo-yo is the headlines. If we watch the headlines, if we get immersed in bad news, I mean, good news doesn't sell. Small earthquake in Chile, nobody hurt. I mean, come on, no one's going to buy that paper. If we watch that spate of bad news day after day after day, we lose sight of the fact that we're gaining ground. Now, there are 3 things at play. This is where the emotional roller coaster comes into play. There are 3 emotions at play. One is risk tolerance. How tolerant are you of risk? Your risk tolerance today is the same as when you were 10 years old. Either you rode that bike too fast or you didn't. You took chances or you didn't. It's how God made you. How much risk can you tolerate? So you've got to determine with a competent advisor what your risk tolerance is and stay within your risk tolerance. In fact, my advice is to find your risk tolerance and cut it in half. Because after all, you've got to sleep at night. But you've got to deal with risk tolerance. It can't change. It doesn't change. Another thing is risk perception. Where's Randy with that 180-pound dog? There you go, Randy. Risk perception is how risky is what I'm doing? How risky is this? Now, we all think we're taking risks in bull markets, but the reward's there. In a bear market, we're taking a lot of risk. Risk perception doesn't change. It is what it is. You think of risk as you think of risk. What we can change is the third component. That's called recency bias. We tend to have a bias toward what happened most recently. I'll give you a couple of examples. If I said to you, what'd you have for lunch every day for the past week? You'd start with yesterday, maybe get the day before, and after that, who knows, who cares? That's the way we remember things. You're driving along a highway. You want to get home, speed limit 65 miles an hour. You don't see a cop for miles. So you know, say if I drive 75, I can get home 10 minutes earlier. So you're going 75 miles an hour, you come around the corner and there's a speed trap. No one chases you, but what do? You slow down. Why? Because there might be another one. I just saw one, there might be another one. That's recency bias. We put so much emphasis on what happened recently. That is the yo-yo. Recency bias we can deal with. How do you do it? It takes discipline. You got to stretch out your time horizon and look at the market as a whole, not day by day. Here's Abelson's yo-yo. And no one released World War II figures till June 4th, 1963. John Kennedy finally released the figures. Now, men, as a lot of you know, don't go to war. Boys go to war. In World War II, we lost 500,000 boys killed in World War II. Germany lost 4 million. Russia lost 20 million boys. Half the factories in Russia destroyed. 1/3 of their homes destroyed. 5 years later, we're back in it. It was so unpopular politically, Harry Truman said, oh, this isn't a war, this is a police action. Well, 600,000 Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River. This became a surrogate war of communism against democracy. We did not want to see communism on the Korean Peninsula. 37,000 kids died in Korea, only 5 years after the end of World War II. So what did the press say? Wait, things will get better. This is why your parents and grandparents didn't invest. Mine didn't either. If they did, we wouldn't be here today, you and I. We'd be on our boat somewhere in Nevis. But here we are, because our parents and grandparents didn't. Here's why the press kept them at bay. The Korean War. Is that any less important to those people then than the World Trade Center was in 2001? No. It's just as important, isn't it, then? Kids today, I don't know if you saw Hillary Clinton on TV the other night on the John Daly show, but she made the point. She's right, kids don't know history. Kids have no idea what we've been through in this country. They have no idea. You ever watch Jay Leno do jaywalking? He took a picture of Saddam Hussein out in the street and said, who's this? And this woman said, Lionel Richie. True story. There's no concept of history in this country. That's the yo-yo. Well, on January 3rd, 1950, the Dow Jones. Now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is only 30 stocks. That's all it is. But it's 70% of the value of publicly traded America. So when someone says the Dow did this, the Dow did that, that's 70% of publicly traded America. The Dow closed that January 3rd, 1950 at 198.89. Okay? The Korean War is going on. Here's the yo-yo. This guy had a massive heart attack, coronary thrombosis. There was no embedded press in those days. The press was not with the White House like they are today. So this country didn't know for almost 2 weeks, for 10 days, what was going on. The stock market hated it. It was catastrophic for the stock market. Most powerful guy in the world under wraps. That's the 50s. How about this? Anybody remember this? Remember their parents talking about this? For those of you over there, it's Russia ignited a fission bomb in 1955. Now, we didn't even know they had the technology. Where did they get it? They bought it from a guy in Iowa who sold them the technology. That was the first time in their life America was frightened. The Soviet Union said, you are not safe in your own beds. I remember being in Bangor, Maine back in those days. We could see it going overhead, pointing at the light going by. Ham radio operators could hear it making a noise. It scared America to death. That's no less important than 9/11 or kids coming across the border from San Salvador or any of the things going on today. And 2 years later, the Soviets beat us out of space, put a Sputnik, remember that name? Put it in outer space, and said we can put that rocket up, we can put that bomb on that satellite over any country in the world, over Frankfurt, Rome, Berlin, Chicago, New York, wherever. We control outer space. We said, my God, what will the Soviets think of next? News was not only 3 networks back in those days. There were 4 in the beginning, then 3 by the end of the 50s. NBC, ABC, and CBS. Who remembers getting 15 minutes of news? Remember that? That's all we got. There was no time to editorialize. No time to inject your opinion. We just got the news. And all we needed was 15 minutes. But we still stay away from the stock market. Look what the Dow did. Look at that gain despite all those horrible things. The press would have you believe the world's coming to an end. So people held off in the 50s, said, okay, the 60s will be better. And I'm telling you younger people, Randy talked about cars and houses. Anybody here, I want to tell you right now, for you younger people in the audience with kids, 1 year of college is the cost of a good car, is it not? In 180 months, a 3-year-old's going to be in college. Are you ready? If you're in this audience and you're 45 years old and you get paid once a month and you want to retire at age 65, you only have 240 paychecks left in your life. And it's game over. Now, if you're 50 years old, you have 180 paychecks left. You've got to get started. But the press is going to keep you at bay. So people in the 50s say, well, that was too dangerous in the 50s. Now, the 60s will be a lot safer. Well, that wall was 96 miles long. It was built of barbed wire. It was replaced by concrete. And Europe was cut in half. And today, there are people living in East Germany, 60 years old and younger, speak Russian, not German. People trying to cross that wall were killed. Europe was cut in half. That is catastrophic. That is just an unbelievable event. If it happened today, it would be an enormous event. We've forgotten it. People have forgotten about the Berlin Wall. John Kennedy was 43 years old when he was elected. Castro spent 13 years in the hills of Mexico and the hills of Cuba with Che Guevara. They came back with an army of 3,000 people. Now, if you showed up with a gun, you were okay. If you had no gun, you were sent home. If you stole money, you were executed. A hardcore army of believers. Took that government away from Juan Batista. Well, the Monroe Doctrine says you can't have Western nations, communist nations interfering in the Western Hemisphere. So Kennedy said, take that government down. Kennedy was 43 years old. Castro said, no. He said, I'll invade. He said, have at it. And the invasion failed. Castro said, I'm frightened. Gromyko sent nuclear missiles. Now, Key West is 97 miles from Havana. 90? I have friends that go Cuba fishing all the time. It's that close. It's closer than Western Pennsylvania. And those missiles were locked and cocked. And Gromyko and Khrushchev said, if you so much as blink, we're going to fire those missiles at every major American city. Anybody remember this? Remember the parents go through this? This, for 13 days, the stock market didn't trade. The entire world sat on edge. The two nuclear powers were toe-to-toe, locked and cocked. The most frightening day in the history of America when that happened. Went on for 13 days. Finally, on the 13th day, Khrushchev blinked. We don't know if it was staged behind the scenes or it was real, but our missiles came out of Turkey, their missiles came out of Cuba. Finally, we can stand down. My God, we're on the brink of nuclear devastation and annihilation. But it's over. Now we can get back to business. Well, no, we can't, because this happened. My mother came from Ireland. She cried for 3 days when John Kennedy died. Nothing more egregious in the history of the country than assassinating that guy. And that decade started with John Kennedy walking down Pennsylvania Avenue. In fact, my father spent his entire life wearing a hat. Remember that? John Kennedy did away with hats. He didn't wear a hat in his inauguration. Men just took off the hats. This guy was so widely admired. That decade ended with Vietnam and Timothy Leary and Woodstock and LSD. It was a horrible, horrible decade in the 60s. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan didn't like Israel. Well, there is something entirely new. If you picture a football field and put a matchbook in the middle of the football field, that's Israel, surrounded by the Middle East. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan attacked Israel. They put that war down in less than a week. Said, do that again, we'll reshape the Middle East. The Middle East was on the verge of total warfare. It was so tense in the 60s. Then Vietnam. 150 boys a week for 8 years. I'm sure there are Vietnam veterans in the room. 150 boys a week for 8 years. And what did we spend our time doing? Discussing the shape of the table in Paris. You remember that? In a war that McNamara later said was a mistake in retrospect. That was that generation. How about this? What is the moral equivalent of this today? Malcolm X, Bobby Kennedy, John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, all gunned down in the space of a decade. What is the equivalent today? What would that do to America today? Who is that? Is that Obama, Pelosi? Is it, don't laughing, Boehner? I mean, think our heroes were gunned down on the streets. If that happened today, the lid would come off this country. Look what the Dow did. People back in the 50s and 60s didn't have the benefit of hindsight. Hindsight's 20/20, I get it. We started at 198, went through the worst decade ever, and look where we are. Now, the 70s, we lost a decade. We lost a decade this past decade. We lost a decade in the 70s. People have forgotten. Why did we lose a decade? What happened in the 1970s? Well, how about Nixon bombing Cambodia for 6 years and lying about it to his own military until he finally got caught? It was an unbelievable event. How about that? Who remembers buying $2 worth of gasoline every other day? And Nixon said, don't sell gas on the weekends. So based on your license plate, you can buy gas every other day, $2 worth of gas. Big V8 engines, you remember that? That was the payback for the Six-Day War, which we weren't even in. We didn't even participate. Lebanon closed its embassy in the United States to pay us back for our participation. We didn't even participate. We took it on the chin. Why? Norman Schwarzkopf said it best. No one likes the United States, but when they want a cop, who do they call? Everyone calls the United States. Worst crash since 1929. This was an amazing decade. The Dow was down 48% over 22 months. It bled to death, 48%. Nixon finally left office, resigned before he was impeached. Nixon never used the IRS, he just threatened to use the IRS. Stephen Biko died on a train to Pretoria. No, Stephen Biko was beaten to death with the grill of a car in a jail cell in Pretoria. He was the originator of the phrase, black is beautiful. That's apartheid in South Africa in the 70s. The lights went on, the cockroaches scurried, apartheid was exposed. Unbelievable decade in the 70s. How about this? What is that? That's the Iranian hostage crisis. Do you remember that? 444 days in captivity. Now, there's nothing funny about that, but there was one funny thing that came out of that. When they came back after 444 days, they were issued lifetime passes for Major League Baseball. Beano Cook, who just passed away, the football announcer, said, my God, haven't they suffered enough? Now they got to go to baseball games. But if you remember, that was the downfall of Jimmy Carter and the beginning of Ronald Reagan. Now, there are only 3 networks until this event. Ted Turner's a smart guy. He said, you know what? There's a thirst for news. What was born? CNN, 1979. Nightline, Ted Koppel, 1979. Cable television, 1979. Now, all of a sudden, we're getting it 24/7, like Randy mentioned. So we weren't good enough with 15 minutes of news. Now we got to have 24 hours of news. When you got to fill time, what do? You extrapolate, you ad lib, you editorialize, you opinionate. Now we get 24 hours of opinion news. Soviets invaded Afghanistan. That was their Vietnam. A horrible war. And look, we lost a decade. But the Dow was at 838. People said, that's it, I quit and I'm done. Just like you want to bet against the Dow for the next 40 years? Well, what happened in the 80s? How about this? Who remembers this? Who had a mortgage near 20%? Anybody? Anybody? What was your rate? Do you remember? 18% mortgage. Is that incredible? Real estate was going down because of interest rates. The stock market was going down. Bonds were getting killed. CDs are going up. I spoke in Petaluma outside of the Bay Area. I talked to a builder who built a 70,000 square foot medical building in 1982. He borrowed $5 million at 25%. He broke even in 2004 because doctors had no money to rent space. That was as bad as it gets in the early 80s. Inflation went through the roof. How about this? 69 days in office. I know you remember that. Now here it is, it's happening again. The news just keeps getting worse and worse. Now we're at fire hose volume. Who knows what that is? That's the Achille Lauro. We just had the anniversary. Palestinian terrorists took over that ship, killed a 69-year-old guy in a wheelchair named Leon Klinghoffer, threw his body overseas, and said, we want prisoners released. They rounded up passengers by passport, by nationality, by ethnicity. So we want our Palestinians released from Israeli jails. The Israelis said, the United States said, we don't negotiate with terrorists. So they negotiated their own escape. A Turkish plane picked them up. They took off. The United States Navy surrounded them in midair. They were taken down in Italy. It's the last we ever saw of them. That's the beginning of the phrase, we don't negotiate with terrorists. And terrorism's not new. It's as old as the mid-'80s. Then the stock market crashed again in 1987. It was down 500 points on Friday and Monday. I know a lot of you were investing then. Just 500 points isn't selling much. It was only at 1900 when it crashed. That's a big chunk of it's almost a quarter of the market. That was an unbelievable decade. How about this guy? Remember this guy, Ollie North? Ronald Reagan, the biggest single drop in popularity in one day in the history of the country over the Iran-Contra affair. The most complicated arms for cash deal ever. There were nations involved, prisoners of war involved, guns, money, drugs. I loved Reagan. They said to Reagan, did you do that? He said, I forget. I might have. I'm a very busy guy. Ask Oliver North. He remembers everything. And there we are at the Iran-Contra affair. And we invaded Panama because I don't know why, but we did. We went after Noriega, remember? And we look at the deck, look at the market in the 80s. Now we've gone from 198 to 20. How about what do the 90s bring? Now more bad news. The first Gulf War. This is a civil war in Yugoslavia. The wheels are coming off the Soviet Union, starting to fall apart. Tear that wall down. This is a coup in Moscow that Gorbachev put down with tanks in 3 days. The Mexican currency crisis. Do you remember that phrase? In the 80s, it was the S&L scandal. In the 90s, it was the Mexican currency crisis and Asian contagion. Remember this guy? This guy said, your kids aren't, 1955, we weren't safe in our beds. McVeigh said, your kids aren't safe in their beds. He denied knowing there were kids in that building. He was sending a videotape going in there 5 times before he blew it up, killed all those kids in the daycare center. An Army veteran mad about Waco and Ruby Ridge. It's as insane as it gets. Asian contagion. Soviets defaulted on every single bond they issued. Complete bond default in the Soviet Union. How about her? Remember her? We forget this guy was impeached. The President of the United States was impeached in the 90s. How bad is that compared? I mean, it's just a huge event. Remember this one? I can't open an account now, Randy. Why? Because on New Year's Eve, my laptop's going to blow up and pop my eyes out. That's why. Planes are going to fall out of the sky, and cars are going to stop in the Ohio Turnpike, and ATMs aren't going to work, and factories are going to go dark. It's Y2K. I heard of one Y2K problem. I spoke shortly after that. This woman approached me. She said, my husband is buried here in the local cemetery. On his headstone are his birth date and his date of death. My headstone's there. This is just before Y2K. On it is my birth date and a blank. She's like, I got like 2 weeks to die, or I got to buy a new headstone. I thought that was really funny. So she had a Y2K problem. It's the only one I ever heard of. But it was huge. And where's the Dow? 11,500. And this news, believe me, folks, was important to you and I then as the stuff is today. We just forget. It's recency bias. I don't know what I had for lunch a week ago. I don't know what happened in the 1980s. All I know is what happened yesterday, what's going to happen today. We've got to look back. How about the 2000s? That is 9/11. That's just, I mean, how about the second Gulf War? Now we're back in it again. Remember Kerry and Bush, red states, blue states, the contentious election? There's no more Republican and Democrat as of that election. It's now you're either for or against. And it's nasty. It's just a nasty thing. Hurricane Katrina, the most expensive natural disaster ever. We focused on that big time. Big time. Bush was criticized for not responding quickly enough. Price of gas went through $4 for the first time in 2005. Then real estate prices started to fall. And foreclosures were rampant. And the market crashed 3 times in 12 years. 2008 was the granddaddy of them all. And Obama bailed everybody out in 2009. And we lost a decade, just like the 1970s. So does it get worse? What does the next 40 years hold? What happens after 2010? Well, it just keeps getting worse. We're still in Afghanistan. The European Union, Germany's holding everybody up. European economy's going south. Earthquake in Haiti, another expensive disaster. Remember the flash crash on May 10th of that year? It was down, the market was down almost 1,000 points in 5 minutes and recovered. Boom, boom, 1,000 points down, 1,000 points up in 5 minutes. Unemployment hit 9%. The guy from Greece resigned, the guy from Italy resigned. They both just give up the reins. Then the biggest nuclear disaster since Chernobyl with the Japanese tsunami. Crippled a nuclear power plant. The United States lost its ratings, and ratings were downgraded. Why? Remember these idiots, Y2K? Occupying Wall Street. I mean, not Y2K, Occupying Wall Street. Fiscal cliff. The headlines are just manufactured now. Superstorm Sandy. The most expensive, contentious piece of legislation ever passed, the Affordable Care Act. J.P. Morgan Chase lost $6 billion because of a rogue trader called a whale. $6 billion in a trade. And then Syria, Assad's still in Syria. And the government finally shut down. The government's closed. But there's the Dow since 1950. And that's what the press will not let people realize. If you look back, I mean, it looks like a no-brainer, doesn't it? But at the time, it's overwhelming. And it's just going to get worse because they've got to sell newspapers, they've got to tell time. So the news is not going to stop. And Randy made an interesting, Randy said one sentence I picked up on, it's just noise. I would focus on one thing, your goals. You got to retire. You're going to, whether you want to or not, at some point, your kids have got to go to school. Focus on your goals. Everything else really is white noise. It's just the press beating a drum all the time. So I'm going to tell you one more story, then I'm done. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it gives you a good perspective. Financial advisors have a hard job. I ran into a young financial advisor who told me he embarrassed himself more than he's ever embarrassed himself in his life. I said, how'd you get so embarrassed? He said, let me tell you the story. I'm not going to tell you the city, but he's in a big city, and there's a guy who's a very famous, notorious investor, and nobody gets to this guy, especially a new advisor. This is Mr. Big, the big client everybody wants. Well, as it turns out, the young advisor's father golfs in the same club as Mr. Big. So he asked his father, please, 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 please. And one day his father came home and said, look, he'll take your phone call. You get one phone call. Don't blow it. So the kid called, and to his surprise, the guy said, come on over. He made it an appointment. The guy said, oh, now I'm in trouble. He didn't expect to get the appointment. Now he's panicked. He's going to go see this guy, and he's a brand new financial advisor, just getting his wings, and now he's talking to one of the biggest investors in the Midwest. So the day came, so they put on a new suit, he shined his shoes, he went over there, and he's sitting in the anteroom, scared to death. He said, any second now, those doors are open, I'm dead. He's old, I'm young, he's smart, I'm an idiot, he's rich, I'm poor, I'm out of here. So he starts to leave. The receptionist said, he'll see you now, and he said, oh, God. So he told me the door opened, biggest office, bigger than Randy's office, biggest office he's ever seen in his life. I don't know if it's that big. Biggest office that he's ever seen in his life. Against the wall, on the other side of the room, is the guy behind his desk with his arms crossed like this. So the kid said, good morning. Not a sound. So he said, oh, this is not going well. He said it again, good morning. Nothing. As he got closer to the guy, he saw a picture of the guy on the credenza with his arm around John Madden. You remember John Madden, the football announcer? Big fat guy, the bombastic guy that screamed and yelled. He said, well, at least the guy's a football fan. I'll talk about football. Maybe I can break the ice. So he said, tell me, sir, how were you lucky enough to get a picture of yourself with your arm around John Madden? And the guy said, that's my wife. So no matter how bad your day's going, it doesn't go that bad. Thank you all very much. If there are any questions, please fire away. Or any comments, or what did I leave out? Name another disaster. What else did I leave out that was as big as that? I thought of another one, the polio scare. Remember that? What else am I missing up there? What else should we be talking? What else should I put in there? What was the biggest disaster in your life, looking back? Most notorious thing that ever happened in your lifetime? Probably shouldn't ask that, should I? You want to come out? Any questions? We covered it all.
Okay, well, I guess we got it all. I appreciate you guys coming out. If you have questions, contact any of us. Drive safe.